It is just after 4 in the morning on March 28, 1979, inside the control room of Unit 2 at 3 Mile Island, a nuclear power station sitting on a sandbar in the Susquehanna River, 10 miles southeast of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. 3 men hear an alarm, then another, then dozens. The annunciator panel above them, hundreds of little windows of colored light, begins to flash all at once, and a printer in the corner starts spitting out data faster than any human being can read it. Craig Faust looks up at the wall. He has been a reactor operator here for a while, a former Navy man like the 2 others on shift with him, and he has run drills for moments like this. But there is no drill for what he is seeing now. Later, asked to describe it, he will say something that historians still quote. He will say he would have given his right arm for that board to make sense. He will say the warning lights gave him no clue at all about what was actually wrong inside the reactor sitting a few feet away through a wall of concrete. What was wrong was simple. A single valve the size of a coffee can had stuck open, and it was quietly draining the water that kept the nuclear core from melting. The men in the room did not know that. The instruments in front of them, some of the most expensive instruments in American industry, were telling them the opposite of the truth. And for the next several hours, acting in good faith on bad information, they would do almost everything wrong, not because they were careless, but because the machine was lying to them. This is the story of how close the United States came to its own nuclear catastrophe. Not in the Soviet Union, not on some distant test range, but a short drive from the state capital of Pennsylvania, in a year most Americans remember for gas lines and disco. A partial meltdown happened that week. Most people still do not know that. Fewer know how it started, how close it came to something far worse, and why, almost half a century later, the country still has not fully recovered its nerve about nuclear power. To understand it, you have to start with how ordinary that night began. 3 Mile Island was not supposed to be famous. It was a working power plant, owned by a utility called Metropolitan Edison, Met-Ed for short, which was itself part of a larger company called General Public Utilities. The island had 2 reactors. Unit 1 had been running for several years. Unit 2 was brand new, built by the firm Babcock and Wilcox, and it had only been generating commercial electricity for about 3 months. On the night of March 28, it was running at 97% of full power, pushing roughly 900 million watts onto the grid, lighting homes across central Pennsylvania. In a pressurized water reactor like this one, the basic idea is straightforward, even if the engineering is not. Uranium fuel in the core gets extremely hot. Water is pumped past it under enormous pressure, so hot it would flash to steam instantly if that pressure ever dropped. That superheated water carries the heat away, boils a separate loop of water into steam, and the steam spins a turbine. Keep the water moving, and the core stays cool. Lose the water, and the fuel has nothing to carry its heat away. It will cook itself. That is the one thing that can never be allowed to happen. And the entire plant, every pump and pipe and backup system, exists to make sure it never does. At 4 in the morning, the trouble began in a part of the plant nobody would have guessed. Workers had been doing maintenance on the system that cleans the plant's water. Through a chain of events that investigators would spend months reconstructing, a small amount of water got into the wrong line, into the instrument air that controlled the pumps. The main pumps feeding water to the steam generators shut off. With nowhere for the heat to go on that side, pressure in the reactor began to climb. The turbine tripped. And here, the automatic safety systems did exactly what they were designed to do. A valve at the top of the pressurizer, the pilot-operated relief valve, or PORV, popped open to let off the rising pressure. This was normal. It was supposed to open, vent a little, and then snap shut once pressure came back down. A few seconds later, the reactor itself scrammed, its control rods slamming down into the core, killing the chain reaction. So far, the plant was behaving. The reaction was stopped. The pressure had been relieved. In a properly working accident, This is where things calmed down. But the relief valve did not snap shut. The signal told it to close, the mechanism failed, the valve stayed open, a hole at the very top of the reactor coolant system, and through that hole, the precious high-pressure water began to escape, second after second, into a tank on the floor below. The core was now slowly losing the very thing that kept it from melting, and in the control room, on the panel in front of Craig Faust and the others, a light indicated that the valve had been commanded shut. That is the detail at the heart of everything that followed. The indicator light did not show whether the valve was open or closed. It showed only whether the signal to close it had been sent. The signal had been sent, so the light said closed. The valve was open. The men trusted the light, because that is what the light was for. And for more than 2 hours, nobody in that room understood that the reactor's lifeblood was pouring out a stuck valve right over their heads. There was a second trap waiting for them, and it had been set days earlier by ordinary maintenance. When the main feedwater pumps tripped at the very start, a backup set of pumps, the auxiliary feedwater, started automatically, exactly as designed, to keep the steam generators supplied. But the water from those backup pumps had nowhere to go. 2 valves in their path had been left closed, apparently after routine maintenance, with no one catching the error. For roughly the first 8 minutes of the emergency, that backup cooling spun uselessly behind shut valves, and the steam generators boiled dry. The operators eventually noticed 2 warning lights, opened the valves, and got the water flowing. 8 minutes does not sound like much. In the early life of a reactor accident, it is an eternity, and it was time the core could not spare. Now, everything they did made the problem worse, and every step felt correct. As the water drained, something strange happened to the gauges. The level in the pressurizer, the tall tank that operators watch to judge how much water is in the system, began to rise instead of fall. To the men in the room, a rising pressurizer level meant the system had too much water. Their training drilled one fear into them above almost all others. They were taught never to let the pressurizer fill completely, never to let it go, in their words, solid, because a system packed solid with water becomes rigid and hard to control. So when the high-pressure emergency pumps kicked in automatically and started flooding water back into the reactor, the operators saw that rising level and did the thing they had been taught to do. They throttled the emergency cooling back. They turned down the one system that was trying to save the core. It was a reasonable decision built on a false reading. The pressurizer level was rising, not because the system was over full, but because steam was forming as the water boiled away and pushed the remaining liquid up into that tank. The instrument they trusted most was pointing them in exactly the wrong direction. The more the core uncovered, the more it looked, on paper, like there was plenty of water. So they kept cutting back the flow that the core desperately needed. By around 6 in the morning, perhaps 2 hours into the event, the top of the nuclear core was no longer covered by water. The fuel rods, long thin tubes of a metal called zircaloy, packed with uranium pellets, began to overheat in the steam. At high temperature, that metal reacts with steam in a way that does 2 dangerous things at once. It strips the cladding off the fuel, and it generates hydrogen gas. The core was beginning to come apart, and a flammable gas was beginning to collect inside the sealed containment building. None of this was visible in the control room. The instruments were not built to show a core that was melting, because the people who designed the plant did not truly believe a core could melt. A change of shift brought fresh eyes. A supervisor coming on duty looked at the numbers, at the temperatures downstream of that relief valve, which were far too hot, and began to suspect the truth. At about 22 minutes past 6, someone finally closed a backup valve, a block valve, behind the stuck porve, sealing off the leak at last. By then, depending on whose estimate you trust, something like 32,000 gallons of coolant had escaped. The bleeding had stopped, but the damage was already deep inside the core, and the worst hours were still ahead, because now the plant had to be understood, and almost nobody understood it. Radiation alarms began to sound inside the plant. Readings climbed in places they should never climb. Met-Ed declared a site emergency, then a general emergency, the most serious category, and the news began to crawl outward, first to state officials, then to the federal regulators at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in Washington, then to a public waking up to confused morning radio reports about a problem at the nuclear plant down the river. What followed over the next several days was, in some ways, as damaging as the meltdown itself, because nobody on the outside could see what was happening inside that reactor, and the people on the inside disagreed about what they were seeing. The information that reached the public was contradictory, incomplete, and at times simply wrong. The utility tended to minimize. The regulators were uncertain and sometimes alarmed. Reporters poured into the area, more than 300 of them, and the questions came faster than anyone could honestly answer. Was radiation escaping? How much? Was it safe to stay? Nobody could give a straight answer, because nobody was sure. Into this stepped the governor of Pennsylvania, a man named Dick Thornburgh, who had been in office for only about 10 weeks. He has said since that the hardest part of those days was that the experts he turned to could not agree, and that he was being asked to make decisions affecting millions of people based on guesses dressed up as facts. He did not want to order a full evacuation. An evacuation of the area around Harrisburg would itself be dangerous, clogging roads, panicking hospitals, separating families, and if it turned out to be unnecessary, it would do real harm for no reason. But he could not promise people they were safe, because no one would promise him. There was also a problem on Friday, the 30th of March, that nearly tipped the whole thing over. A burst of radiation was vented, and reports reached Thornburgh that there might be a bubble of hydrogen gas forming inside the reactor vessel, the hydrogen that the overheated core had been generating. The fear voiced by some at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was that this bubble could either block cooling or, in a nightmare scenario, explode and breach the containment, spreading radioactive material across central Pennsylvania. For a day or two, that fear sat at the center of everything. It is the closest the story comes to the kind of catastrophe people imagine when they hear the words nuclear accident. On the advice of the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Joseph Hendry, Thornburgh issued a careful, partial warning. He advised pregnant women and preschool-age children to leave the area within a 5-mile radius of the plant, and he recommended that everyone within 10 miles stay indoors. He chose those words deliberately, trying to protect the most vulnerable without triggering a stampede. It did not entirely work. The advisory, combined with days of frightening headlines, was enough. People packed bags and got in their cars. By some counts, around 140,000 people left the region in the days that followed, far more than the narrow advisory had called for. Schools closed, banks saw runs. A part of Pennsylvania emptied out in fear of something it could not see. It is worth pausing on what those days felt like for ordinary families, because the numbers do not capture it. Imagine living a few miles from that island. You wake up to a radio voice telling you there has been an accident at the plant, but that everything is under control. By afternoon, a different voice says, radiation has been detected. The next day, the governor, careful as he is, singles out pregnant women and small children, which tells every parent in the county exactly how serious this might be. You have no way to measure the air around you. The experts on television contradict each other. The company that runs the plant keeps saying it is fine, and the company is the last voice you trust. Some people loaded their children and drove west and did not look back for a week. Others stayed, taped their windows, kept the kids inside, and waited, listening for the next bulletin, not knowing whether staying was brave or foolish. That uncertainty, the sense of being asked to gamble with your family on information no one could vouch for, is the wound 3 Mile Island left on the people who lived through it, and it lasted long after the reactor cooled. Then came a moment that calmed the country as much as any briefing could. On Sunday, April 1, the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, came to 3 Mile Island. Carter was not just any president for this. He had trained as a nuclear engineer in the Navy under Admiral Hyman Rickover, and years earlier, as a young officer, he had helped with the dangerous cleanup of a damaged experimental reactor in Canada. He understood what he was walking into better than almost any leader could. With his wife Rosalind beside him and reporters watching, Carter toured the control room of the crippled plant. The message was unmistakable. If the president will stand inside it, it cannot be about to blow up. The public read it exactly that way. Behind the scenes, the engineers had begun to win. The hydrogen bubble, the thing that had frightened everyone, turned out to be far less dangerous than feared. Later analysis showed that an explosion had never actually been possible because there was not enough free oxygen inside the sealed vessel to let the hydrogen ignite. The bubble was gradually managed and reduced over the days that followed by venting and by getting cooling water moving steadily through the core again. By the early days of April, the reactor was being brought to a stable, cooled, shut-down state. The acute crisis was over. The plant had not exploded. No great cloud had crossed Pennsylvania. By the standards of what people feared, it was an enormous relief. But the relief hid a hard fact that would not be fully understood for years. When engineers finally got cameras and probes deep inside the reactor vessel, long after the public had moved on, they found that the accident had been far worse than even the worst days had suggested. Close to half of the nuclear core, something on the order of 60 tons of uranium fuel, had melted. A portion of that molten mass, roughly 20 tons of it, had flowed down and collected at the bottom of the reactor vessel, the thick steel pot that was the last barrier holding everything in. The molten fuel had sat against that steel, and the steel had held. Just barely, by the judgment of some who studied it, the vessel was not breached. The thing the entire plant was built to prevent, a core melting down, had in fact happened. It had simply happened inside a container, strong enough to keep it from reaching the world outside. That is what makes 3 Mile Island so unsettling. It was simultaneously a near miss and a real meltdown. The public was told, accurately, that almost no radiation reached them and that no one was killed. And inside the building, accurately, a reactor core had partly turned to slag. Both things were true at once, and the gap between them, between how it looked and how bad it actually was, became the entire subject of the investigation that followed. President Carter wanted answers the public could trust, so he appointed a commission and put a respected outsider in charge of it. The chairman was John Kemeny, a mathematician and the president of Dartmouth College, a man with no ties to the nuclear industry. The Kemeny Commission spent months taking testimony, reading the data, and reconstructing every minute of that morning. Its report, delivered at the end of October 1979, did not read like the work of people trying to protect anyone. It was blunt. The commission found that the equipment failure, the stuck relief valve, was real but was not the heart of the matter. Valves fail. Systems are built with the assumption that things will break. What turned a manageable malfunction into a partial meltdown was everything around the valve. It was the people, the training, the procedures, and above all, the design of the machine that the people had to operate. The commission concluded that the accident's deeper cause was, in plain terms, human, and it spread the blame for that human failure across the entire enterprise. Consider what the operators had been working with. The control room had hundreds upon hundreds of indicators, lights, and gauges, packed together with little thought for how a person under stress would actually read them. In the first minutes of the accident, more than 100 alarms went off, with no way to sort the trivial from the critical. The one indicator that mattered most, the position of that relief valve, did not even report the valve's true state. The men were trained heavily to avoid one rare problem, the pressurizer going solid, and that training drove them to fight the emergency cooling that would have saved the core. They were, the commission essentially found, set up to fail by a system that confused them at the exact moment it most needed to inform them. There was another finding that stung. That same model of relief valve, on that same design of reactor, had stuck open before, at other plants, in earlier incidents. The information existed. It had simply never made its way clearly to the operators who would one day need it, nor produced the warnings or the fixes it should have. The lesson had been available and had gone unlearned. The commission described an industry and a regulator that had grown complacent, convinced that a serious accident was so unlikely that they did not need to plan, in their bones, for the day it arrived. The recommendations changed the business permanently. Operator training was overhauled and made far more rigorous, with heavy use of full-scale control room simulators so that crews could live through accidents that had never happened to them before. Control rooms were redesigned with human beings in mind. A new organization, formed by the industry itself, was created to police standards across every plant in the country, on the theory that a meltdown anywhere was a threat to nuclear power everywhere. Emergency planning, the coordination between utilities and state and local governments that had been so ragged that week, was rebuilt from the ground up, with detailed evacuation plans required for the zones around every reactor. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission itself was shaken up. In a strange way, the accident made American nuclear plants that kept running considerably safer than they had been the day before. And here is the eerie part, the coincidence that no screenwriter would dare invent. 12 days before the accident, on March 16, 1979, a Hollywood film had opened in theaters across the country. It was called The China Syndrome, and it starred Jane Fonda, Jack Lemmon, and Michael Douglas. It told the story of a television reporter who stumbles onto a cover-up at a nuclear power plant, where a near accident is hidden from the public, and where the danger is described in a line of dialogue as a meltdown that could render an area the size of Pennsylvania permanently uninhabitable. The nuclear industry had attacked the movie as alarmist fiction, a smear on a safe technology. Then, 12 days later, the size of Pennsylvania stopped being a screenwriter's phrase. A real reactor in Pennsylvania partly melted down. The film, already in theaters, suddenly looked less like fiction and more like prophecy, and audiences poured in to see it. The collision of the imagined disaster and the real one did something to the American mind that statistics never could. It welded the idea of nuclear power to the idea of catastrophe, and that weld held for a generation. So what did 3 Mile Island actually cost? In direct human terms, the official answer is stark and important. No one was killed in the accident, and no injury or death has ever been firmly tied to the radiation it released. The radiation that escaped was real but small. Studies have estimated that the average extra dose to the roughly 2 million people living nearby was tiny, on the order of what a single chest X-ray delivers, far below the natural background radiation everyone receives every year just from living on the planet. The most careful long-term studies of cancer rates in the area, including a large one done over many years by researchers at the University of Pittsburgh, found no clear increase that could be blamed on the accident. That is not the end of the argument, and an honest telling has to say so. Some scientists have challenged those reassuring studies, pointing out that the dose estimates from the chaotic early hours were incomplete, and that a few analyses have hinted at small effects that are hard to interpret. Residents of the area have their own memories of dead pets and wilted gardens that the data cannot fully confirm or deny. The mainstream scientific verdict remains that 3 Mile Island produced no measurable wave of disease, but people who lived through it have never been entirely at peace with that verdict. And after a week of being told contradictory things by everyone in authority, it is not hard to understand why their trust never fully returned. The cleanup told its own long story. Getting the wrecked core out of that reactor safely was one of the hardest industrial jobs ever attempted in the country. It took close to 12 years. Workers had to peer into a vessel full of melted, radioactive debris, devise tools to break it up and lift it out remotely, and ship it away, all without anyone getting hurt. The bill came to roughly $1 billion, and the work was not finished until December 1993. Unit 2 never produced electricity again. It was sealed up, its fuel removed, monitored and waiting, a tomb on the river. The largest cost, though, was the one that did not show up on any balance sheet. 3 Mile Island broke the momentum of nuclear power in the United States, and it broke it for decades. Before that morning, the industry was booming, with new plants being ordered and built across the country. The future of American electricity. After it, that future stalled. Dozens of planned reactors were canceled in the years that followed. Utilities lost the appetite. Regulators tightened everything. Costs and delays piled up, and the public would no longer easily accept a reactor in its backyard. For more than 30 years, not a single new commercial nuclear plant was ordered, started, and completed in the United States. An entire path the country might have taken toward more nuclear and less coal simply closed. Whatever you think about that outcome, it traces back in large part to one stuck valve and a week of fear in 1979. When you stand back from all of it, the strangest thing about 3 Mile Island is how little separated the near miss from the disaster, and how much of that margin came down to information. The hardware that failed was minor and well understood. A valve stuck. Valves stick. What nearly turned that into an American Chernobyl was not the valve, but the blindness around it, the gauge that lied, the alarms that drowned out the truth, the training that aimed people at the wrong fear, the warnings from earlier incidents that never reached the men who needed them. The core melted because skilled, sober, dedicated people could not see what was in front of them and acted, hour after hour, on a picture of reality that was false. That is the part worth carrying with you. We tend to imagine catastrophe as a single, violent failure, a bomb, a break, an explosion. 3 Mile Island is a reminder that the more modern danger is quieter. It is the failure of a complicated system to tell the people running it the truth, fast enough and clearly enough, before a small problem becomes a large one. The men in that control room were not fools. They were highly trained, and they were doing their best with the picture they were given. The picture was wrong. That can happen in a cockpit, in a hospital, in a financial system, in any place where humans sit at the edge of a machine too complex to fully see. The lesson of that night was never really about uranium. It was about the gap between what our instruments say and what is actually true, and how thin the line can be when that gap opens at the wrong moment. The reactor on the river is quiet now. The cooling towers still stand over the Susquehanna, and for most of the people driving past on the highway, they are just shapes against the sky, a thing that happened a long time ago to somebody else. But for a few hours in the spring of 1979, a stuck valve and a misread dial put this country one step from a disaster it had only ever seen in the movies, and the only reason most Americans never had to find out how bad it could get is that, in the end, the last barrier held. If stories like this one, the close calls history almost forgot, are the kind of thing you want more of, you know what to do.